Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new ForoCompetencia virtual breakfast. Today we have the honor to have as a guest Professor Herbert Hovenkamp, who I have the advantage of knowing that everyone knows him very well. He is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Without further introduction, he will be talking today about metering antitrust merger policy. Without further introduction, I'll give the floor to Professor Hovenkamp. Professor.
Thank you, and thank you all for taking the time to listen. I'm going to talk today about some of the metrics of merger policy, focusing particularly on the USA's 2023 merger guidelines and on the mechanisms we use for measuring overall effects of mergers. For that, I'm going to share some slides. Get those up here in a second. Okay, you should be seeing some slides.
Yes.
Good, thank you. Okay, the premises of merger policy, the statute says we condemn mergers that threaten to substantially lessen competition or create a monopoly, mainly because the triggers for enforcement tend to come in at market shares of 30% or lower. The substantially lessened competition portion of the statute ends up doing almost all of the work. That is, there's not very much left over for mergers that tend to create a monopoly, because pretty much de facto all of them substantially lessen competition. Okay, well, how does that happen? Well, every merger creates the potential for reduced market output and higher prices, depending on market shares and the structure and nature of the market. At the same time, mergers present a considerable opportunity for cost reductions, and as a result, the price or output effects of a merger are not a foregone conclusion, but both the price increasing effects and the price reducing effects have to be examined and, if necessary, netted out. If we define the goal of merger policy in terms of reduced output and higher prices, then its principal beneficiaries are vertically related entities. That is, mergers that result in reduced prices and higher output, they tend to benefit downstream participants such as consumers, both commercial and personal and consumer. But they also tend to benefit labor and other input suppliers who are better off as markets get bigger. That is, as output goes up, workers and input suppliers are benefited as well. Mergers that have these effects do tend to harm rivals, particularly those who are unable to attain the same cost reductions. So the one question that always arises in these cases is, well, what kind of metric do you use to balance the price increasing effects resulting from increased market power and the price reducing effects that result from increased efficiency? Well, it turns out that articulating that issue is fairly easy. The metrics can be more difficult. The merger guidelines, ever since the early 1980s, have attempted to capture this. Both the 2010 version, which was more exclusively focused on market power, and the more recent 2023 guidelines, which have a little more diverse set of concerns, but in general, they try to do the same thing. Now, how do you deal with the two? Well, the first big attempt to deal with them in an express fashion was the Williamson-Bork welfare trade-off model. That model was proposed by Williamson in the late 1960s in a very famous article on welfare effects of mergers. And then Robert Bork picked it up in 1978 in the Antitrust Paradox. The picture here is simply a photocopy of the figure that's in Robert Bork's Antitrust Paradox book, okay? The unique features of the Williamson-Bork model is that they assumed a merger that actually increased prices and reduced output, but that also had offsetting efficiency effects. So if you look at this model, you see two gray shaded figures. The gray shaded triangle in the upper right, that's the conventional welfare loss that results from the reduced output and higher prices that the merger produces. And the smaller gray shaded triangle below and to the left is cost savings that accrue when this merger occurs. And Williamson proposed under the welfare trade-off model that the effects of the merger could be assessed by simply comparing the sizes of these two figures. Of course, you have to collect the data and do the computations, but once you've done that, you should be able to tell whether a merger is efficient or inefficient on balance. Well, there's a lot of things worth observing about the welfare trade-off model. First of all, Williamson himself acknowledged that it was egregiously oversimplistic. Well, that's true, but lots of models like Cournot are quite simplistic and they're quite useful anyway. Williamson lumped all costs together under the two horizontal lines in this figure, AC1 and AC2, are simply average costs. So the model did not distinguish between fixed costs and variable costs. More problematically, the model never explained how it is that a merger would simultaneously produce these significant output reductions and yet have such lower costs. Now, this is the Bork figure, that reddish oval at the bottom, that's just my felt pen, but basically output in the Bork model is reduced by half. That is, this merger produces half as much as the two firms did prior to the merger, yet average costs are lower. And you start thinking about the relationship between output and cost. Well, the first thing we think about when we think about cost reductions is economies of scale, but economies of scale accrue only at higher output rather than lower output. Related to that, we might think of mergers in terms of fixed costs. Fixed costs go down on a per unit basis as output goes up. So whatever this merger was, it must not have been a merger in a market that had very significant fixed costs. Otherwise, costs would certainly go up as the output from this merger went down. On the other hand, if there aren't very significant fixed costs, then what exactly is the source of the monopoly? Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the Bork-Williamson model describes an empty set. Don't know that for sure, but at the very least, it seems that a merger that results in an output reduction of this magnitude is highly unlikely to produce per unit cost reductions of this magnitude as well. That is to say, it would be uh, a highly exceptional case. Okay, that was one problem with the Bork-Williamson model. Another problem is that it's a monopoly model. It assumes a merger. What it basically assumed was a two-firm market where the merger creates a monopoly. So you're looking at the total market when you look at this figure. Well, that's not where the cutting edge of merger policy occurs, right? Most of our mergers today occur at much lower concentration levels. The 2023 guidelines suggest that a merger will be unlawful if it creates a firm with a market share of greater than 30%. Well, in that case, the trade-off model egregiously understates the amount of harm caused by the merger. That is, the harm caused by the merger is not of single firm output reduction, but rather of collusion or some kind of coordinated interaction that reduces output. So the output reduction accrues across the entire market, but the cost savings from the merger accrues only to the two merging firms. Okay, so if the cost savings covers only firms aggregating, say, 30% of the market, well, then this particular picture understates the social cost of that merger by a factor of at least 3. And as a result, the bottom line for me is the Bork-Williamson model egregiously exaggerates the impact of efficiencies both as a conceptual matter and as a practical matter of identifying circumstances in which these big output reductions can be correlated with major reductions in output. The last point on the slide is simply that I regard this as kind of an example of what Ronald Coase once called blackboard economics, which is the fallacy of thinking that if you can write a picture on a blackboard, you've described the real world. And I don't think this picture in any way describes very much of the real world. I'll be glad to talk about that during question and answer if you want. Okay, then we have, as an alternative, the brown shoe position. Now, U.S. versus brown shoe is a 1962 merger case which acknowledged that significant efficiencies could result from a merger, but actually condemned it because of the efficiencies. So this is a quotation from the district court's opinion, which the Supreme Court affirmed in brown shoe. And the entire thrust of the quotation is that this merger is bad because it results in lower prices or higher quality shoes for the same price. And the result is that competitors, independent retailers, are having a harder and harder time competing. Today, most of us, not all, but most of us regard that as a kind of perverse approach to mergers. That is, condemning mergers because they produce better products or because they reduce costs on the theory that the harm is, so those mergers will harm consumers because of higher prices and reduced output. They will harm labor because of reduced job opportunities in the upstream labor market. However, they do benefit rivals who are unable to attain the same level of efficiencies. Okay, so that then brings us to the merger guidelines approach, which, and I'm going to compare the 2010 and 2023 guidelines here. I mean, for one thing, we have a pretty well-established history of case law in the U.S. interpreting the 2010 guidelines. The 2023 guidelines were issued in final form just this past December, and so far there's one decision that acknowledges their existence. That's the JetBlue merger case. But even that case went ahead and interpreted or relied on the 2010 guidelines. So we don't have any judicial decisions in the U.S. that actually interpret the 2023 guidelines. The recent case that the FTC filed against the Albertsons-Kroger merger, that's this very large merger of two national grocery chains in the U.S., that one references standards from the 2023 guidelines, but that one is still in the complaint stage. It may be a year or more before we get a district court opinion in that case. So the 2010 guidelines position was that efficiencies would be recognized, but the efficiencies would have to be so substantial that the net impact of the merger was not to increase price or reduce output. That is, the efficiencies had to be large enough so that prices following the merger would be no higher and market output would be no lower. And the unique thing about the 2010 guidelines approach, it was that it was quite focused on prices and output. In fact, in general, it was focused on market power. The 2023 guidelines are more eclectic. They focus on a variety of things like working conditions, references to product quality, and so on. But they ultimately come down in roughly the same place, which is that the efficiencies have to be of a sufficient magnitude that the merger will not harm competition in any market. Now, this is kind of interesting because the stated position of the antitrust left in the U.S., or the neo-Brandeis or anti-monopoly group, is that efficiencies should be irrelevant in merger analysis. In fact, Lena Khan herself, chair of the FTC, has said on numerous occasions that there is no efficiency defense in the statute. That is factually correct. The Section 7 of the Clayton Act does not reference efficiencies. But more importantly is the factual belief that efficiencies rarely or even never occur. And there's been quite an effort on the far left to show that mergers almost never produce efficiencies. Well, that then invites some consideration of how exactly it is you study for that. And today, of course, we've got a pretty well-established record of merger retrospective studies. They come in a wide variety. Some of them look at a single merger. For example, there's some very good studies of the cellular phone industry. Some of them look at a big variety of mergers. A recent one in retailing looks at about 50 mergers in a variety of situations. What they generally do, not always, but what they generally do is they don't really seek to measure efficiency directly. Now, efficiency is, of course, a function of cost. When you say a merger is efficient, that means that in some way it reduces costs or relatedly improves product quality or quality of consumer experience. The most immediately relevant metric is variable cost, because variable cost shows up in marginal cost, and thus it shows up in the price. So, a merger that reduces variable cost will show up in the fairly short run as something that reduces price. Mergers that reduce fixed costs may or may not affect the price, but it'll take a longer time. And then if you look at some of these other things like product quality, and so most of the time you're looking at longer run or at least middle run phenomena that don't occur immediately. Nevertheless, in spite of this hostility, towards efficiencies. The 2023 guidelines acknowledge the efficiency defense. They pretty much follow after the 2010 guidelines and saying, yes, we acknowledge it, but efficiencies should be fairly difficult to prove. They generally follow accepted practice, which is to give a more or less automatic efficiency credit, at least in econometric analysis of mergers. Doesn't show up so much in market share analysis. But for example, in unilateral effects cases, the practice has been to simply assume that the merger is going to yield a marginal cost reduction or variable cost reduction, typically in the 5% or so range. And so then the theory is that, okay, we're giving you this credit in the analysis of the merger. Any additional efficiencies will have to be proven, and furthermore, that proof has to be fairly strict. The evidence has to be strong. The efficiencies have to be shown to be merger specific, which means that they cannot readily be obtained other than through the merger. And the result has been that overall efficiencies have been fairly difficult to prove as a separate element. That is, there are not all that many, there are some, there are not all that many cases that find significant efficiencies that result from mergers. The Deutsche Telekom cellular phone case did. It found significant efficiencies resulting from that particular merger, and there's some pretty good empirical literature that bears that out. In the more recent JetBlue case, which is from January of this year, that involved a merger of two lower cost airlines, JetBlue and Spirit Airlines. The court found that there were significant efficiencies on many routes. And airlines, single pairs of cities are generally considered to be relevant markets. And the court found that there were significant efficiencies on many of those routes. However, there were some routes in which predicted prices would go up, particularly routes where those two carriers dominated. And under what's called the single market rule, I'll come talk about it a little bit later, if a merger is anti-competitive in one market under a strict application of the single market rule, then it is illegal, and it doesn't matter that there might be beneficial effects in other markets. So, you know, there's a history of finding efficiency effects in mergers, but not a lot, not a lot of cases that find efficiencies once a merger has crossed the threshold into prima facie illegality, which I'll get to in a second. So the standard then in the 2010 guidelines, appearing at the top of this slide, is that they must be of a character and magnitude so that the merger is not likely to be anti-competitive in any market. And that's a severe test in cases in which production facilities are widely scattered. So for example, airlines is an example where if a city pair is a market, well, then major airlines might be operating in dozens, perhaps even hundreds of markets. Theoretically, the test would say if one of those markets shows competitive harm, then it doesn't matter if there are greater efficiencies in the other ones. And that's why, of course, we've got this movement to fix it first, which is that the firms in the first instance and the agencies later try to identify specific markets in which competition will be harmed, and then the merging parties are invited to try to spin off assets in those markets in order to relieve the competitive pressure so that the merger is finally pro-competitive. One thing that's currently being debated, but without any resolution in the courts, is whether the single market test is too severe. I mean, the JetBlue case raises the possibility of a merger that could be efficient in literally dozens of markets, inefficient in one or two markets, and it would be condemned on that latter basis, even though the net effect of the merger could be to benefit consumers with lower prices overall. The 2023 guidelines word the requirement a little bit differently, but it's essentially the same. They want to know that within a short period of time, the merger, the benefits of any efficiency will prevent the risk of a substantial lessening of competition in the relevant market. Okay, if those conditions are met, and I think this is an important consideration when, just as a matter of statutory interpretation, if those conditions are met, then no welfare trade-off is needed. That is to say, if the merger results in higher output and lower prices after we've netted out the efficiencies, then there isn't any lessening of competition, and then it really doesn't matter that Section 7 of the Clayton Act does not include an express efficiencies defense. Okay, as to pass on, this whole question of what the impact of the efficiencies is, like I said earlier, in a pure model, variable costs are the ones that get passed on. One thing to keep in mind is that in highly competitive markets, efficiencies do not get passed on very much because there isn't any price effect to begin with. That is to say, the whole assumption of an efficiency effect is that there is some market power because market price is going to have to be correlated with output of the merging firms. So, for example, I give the example here of two farmers who merge and they're able to reduce their production cost a certain amount. Well, that merger is not going to have any impact on price to begin with because each of them has such a tiny market share, and as a result, the efficiencies will not have any impact to begin with. So we don't need to worry about that merger. That's why the bite of the efficiency effects should come in only after a prima facie case of illegality has been met, and like I say, under U.S. law, that would require a post-merger market share exceeding 30%, or in some cases, a merger in which the post-merger HHI exceeds 1,800, and the increase in the HHI exceeds 100. Okay, then on the structural standards, I don't want to dwell on these. I think everybody's familiar with them. The 2010 guidelines identified an HHI exceeding 2,500. Remember, HHI is equal to the sum of the squares of the market shares of the firms in the market. So if the HHI exceeded 2,500 and the delta HHI, so that would be the increase in the HHI. So you look at the HHI prior to the merger and subsequent to the merger, and you consider whether the change exceeded 200 HHI points. That merger would have triggered presumptive illegality under the 2010 guidelines. They were a little more complicated than that because they divided the markets up into three classifications, but as a practical matter, not very many mergers were challenged when the HHI was lower than 2,500. The 2023 guidelines reduced that back to 1,800, so they're more aggressive, and they also reduced the HHI change, the delta HHI, back to 100. That second reduction is much more dramatic in terms of measuring effects than the first one. That is a change in the HHI of 100 points or more represents a pretty aggressive move in merger enforcement. And that then raises the question, okay, are these the right numbers? Well, first of all, the 2023 guidelines do not do a good job of defending those particular numbers. They talk a lot about increases in concentration. They cite the brown shoe case a whole bunch of times. What they don't do, however, is come up with a convincing argument that correlates the 1800 HHI plus 100 delta HHI standard with with the presumptive trigger. The question is, what triggers a prima facie case against a merger? In spite of that, I think the empirical evidence suggests a couple of things. Number one is that the impact of mergers on prices and output is incredibly heterogeneous, so there's a lot of variety. But secondly, I believe the 1800 delta 100 numbers are really not all that far off. They're under deterrent for some mergers, they're over deterrent for some other mergers, but if you had to pick a spot for triggering presumptive illegality, this is probably not a very bad place to do it. And so there have been a number of recent studies that have focused on both correlations between large mergers and post-merger HHIs, and also mergers and the increases in the HHIs. And they generally come to the consensus that two quite important things. One is that the approach taken is fundamentally correct. That is to say, there is a link between post-merger HHIs and post-merger prices, and there's also a link between increases in the HHI and post-merger prices. However, the metrics have been wrong. The metrics have been too under-deterrent. Now, these studies all reference the 2010 guidelines, which were up at the higher 2500 number, but they're pretty consistent that the metrics articulated in the 2010 guidelines were more likely to exonerate an anti-competitive merger than they were to condemn a harmless merger. That is, they generated more false negatives than false positives. And so I think it is correct to say that the change in the 2023 guidelines is in fact a movement in the right direction. I'll just add as an aside here that this represents to a fairly significant extent a return to a type of structuralism in merger guidelines that has been attacked quite a bit by the Chicago School back in the 80s. That attack has somewhat now waned, but this revision in the 2023 guidelines indicates greater emphasis on market structure and the structural changes that a merger produces. Okay, now what about the Philadelphia Bank guideline? The Philadelphia Bank presumption was that a merger that creates a post-merger market share of 30% or more and that increases concentration significantly is independently challengeable. Okay, now that came out of the Philadelphia Bank case, which was 1 year after Brown Shoe, 1963. There has not been very much in the way of empirical verification of that particular proposition. That is, most of the studies, I think all of the studies that correlate merger pricing and output with market concentration look at market-wide HHIs and delta HHIs. The Philadelphia bank approach is different because it very largely ignores the market shares of the other firms. You still have to define a market, but once you've defined it, if you can conclude that the post-merger firm has a market share exceeding 30%, then you have established a prima facie case, and you don't have to worry about what the overall market concentration is. That's a proposition that remains largely untested in the empirical literature. Okay, on the Philadelphia bank presumption, I think there's some other important observations about it. Number one is its 30% presumption. The other thing I want to emphasize, however, is that the neo-Brandeis movement in the U.S., the anti-monopoly movement, has generally been characterized as hostile towards economics. And I think, at least for many people writing in that portion of is correct. They don't like the use of economics. They want to take more economics out of mergers. The emphasis on the brown shoe case is in part that, an effort to cleanse, not pay all that much attention to things like market shares. I mean, Brown's market share was only 7%. The HHI was well under 1,000. Hard to compute because we don't have data about the market shares of all the firms in that market in 1962. But it was clearly far, far under the share thresholds in either the 2010 guidelines or the 2023 guidelines. But any thinking that brown shoe represented a turn away from the use of economics in merger cases, I believe was completely undermined by the Philadelphia bank case, which is only a year later. That case cited, first of all, it cited 7 industrial economists in the course of one opinion. That was more economists than had been cited in any Supreme Court antitrust case up to that time. And then for the 30% presumption itself, it cited Carl Kaisen and Donald Turner's book on antitrust policy. They recommended a presumption of 20% as a trigger for presumptive illegality. Stigler, you might be a little surprised to see Stigler in this group. This was actually work that Stigler had done in the 1950s. He changed his mind later on. But at the time of the Philadelphia bank case, Stigler advocated a 20% presumption for mergers. Jesse Markham, probably a little bit less known than the others. He was at Virginia most of his career. He advocated 25%. All of these people were what we would call today Harvard School structuralists. They came from the structural approach to antitrust policy that was developed mainly in the Harvard economics department in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So the Philadelphia bank case represents the return of economics with a vengeance. Wasn't quite the same economics we might use today, but nevertheless, it was well established from the dominant school of economic analysis at the time that case was decided. Okay, the balance of the slide talks about the single market rule, which I've already mentioned. Now, on the merger retrospective studies, number one, there are a lot of them. Like I said earlier, some of them are single market studies. Some of them are even single merger studies. Some of them are bigger studies that aggregate mergers over a fairly wide range. One of them that I hold up to my students as an exemplar is this Bhattacharya study from the National Bureau of Economic Research. I put the number of the paper there in case you want to read it for yourself. It's public domain. You can access it for free. That study looked at completed mergers, mainly in retail. In fact, I think exclusively in retail. All of them occurred in what we would today characterize as concentrated markets. The markets ranged roughly over post-merger HHI from 2000 to 4000. So all of them were concentrated under the 2023 guidelines. A few of them were not so concentrated under the 2010 guidelines, but they were all challengeable under the 2023 guidelines. Well, they produced a pretty significant distribution. Most importantly, first of all, half of them had effects on prices that were within the margin of error. So essentially no measurable effect on prices whatsoever. Of the remaining ones, roughly equal shares, 25% of them resulted in increased prices, and the average increase was 5.9%. Another 25% reduced prices, and the average of the reductions was 5.2%. So there's kind of an even balance in price increasing versus price decreasing mergers, although the amounts tilt a little bit more in the direction of price increasing. Now remember, these mergers were approved under the 2010 guidelines, so you would expect a little bit different result if you looked under the 2023 guidelines, because they would have brought in more and challenged more of these mergers. In fact, they might have challenged all of them. The study finds a pretty strong correlation with absolute HHI levels post-merger, somewhat weaker correlation with the delta HHI, with the change in HHI, and they reach this fairly important conclusion in point 5 on this slide, which is that correction of this standard, that is, if we were to lower the standard, make the standard stricter, as we did in the 2023 guidelines, we would go after many, many more mergers. In fact, at one point they suggest that we'd end up challenging roughly 4 times as many mergers as the agencies currently do. However, necessarily that would yield significantly greater enforcement costs. And indeed, Congress has been pretty resistant on this score, and just a week or two ago, largely in response to merger law aggressiveness, they cut the budget of the Justice Department. That political theater has not yet completely played out, but the idea that the Justice Department is going to be able to challenge 4 times as many mergers as they're currently challenging may in fact be fanciful. Although it does raise this other thing, which I could just characterize as a policy question at the end of this slide. I don't know the answer to it, which is maybe we should be putting fewer resources into these big tech monopolization cases and more resources into merger policy. The big tech cases, they're very, very expensive. They cost a lot of money to litigate. They're high risk in the sense that there's a high degree of probability for several of them that the government's going to lose on one or more claims. And the benefits, according to a lot of people, are fairly dubious, fairly inconsequential, certainly when compared to the benefits that might result from condemning more price increasing mergers. I'm not going to express any final conclusions about that, but I think this is a question we've got to be thinking about more. The other thing that the mergers indicate, the merger guidelines and 23 guidelines indicate, is a revival of the brown shoe idea that a more aggressive standard should be applied when there is a trend toward concentration. Now, that was an idea that actually originated way back at the time of the New Deal in a number of New Deal era studies. It was picked up in the brown shoe case, largely disregarded later on, and now it has been renewed. And that, of course, raises the question, what causes trends towards concentration? Well, I think today the economic consensus is that one of the big causes of increased trends towards concentration is technological change that favors bigger firms. And furthermore, to the extent that is the reason, that is, chain stores have replaced single-family stores, that increases concentration. Often technologies of production produce significant economies of scale. For example, as you move from horses and buggies to automobiles, you have room for many, many fewer firms in the market. But for most of these situations, increases in concentration benefit consumers or result in lower prices or more innovation or output than before. The other thing that explains increased concentration is increased disparity in firm size, and that largely results from the emergence of superstars, but I've just given this very crude example here. Suppose you start out with a market of 10 equal firms, each one has 10%, so that yields an HHI of 100 times 10 or 1,000. But now two of the firms are capable of achieving significant innovation or growth. Other firms become laggards. Some of the firms kind of stay stationary. And so as a result, you get this size distribution at the third bullet there, a couple of 25% firms, a couple that have remained at 10, and several that have declined. Well, the HHI of that new distribution of firms has moved from 1,000 up to 1,600. So we still got 10 firms, but now we have a higher concentration level, not because the HHI is sensitive to two things. One is the number of firms in the market, and the other one is the size distribution of the firms in a market. And so should we have a more aggressive merger policy in a market that has exhibited a trend towards concentration, my own conclusion is that trends towards concentration are at least equally consistent with the proposition that this market is moving into a higher output, lower price, higher innovation, or that is to say better direction, rather than a worse direction, which is not to say that there aren't some anti-competitive consequences from increases in concentration, but I think the presumptions very largely go in the other direction. In addition, and this is a contribution in the 2023 guidelines, they focus more on mergers of complements. What happens when the products of the two merging firms are complements rather than competitors? Number one, our traditional classification of mergers is not good at identifying mergers of complements. We have traditionally divided mergers into horizontal, vertical, and potential competition. Vertical mergers are, in fact, mergers of complements. That is to say, a firm and its distribution or a firm and its inputs are complements. But we've never had a separate classification of mergers for complements. Their history is very old. The first Supreme Court case, it's in the third bullet on this slide, Sidney Winslow, that involved the merger that created the United Shoe Machinery Company. That was a merger of three firms that made three types of machinery essential for the production of leather shoes: lasting machines, button fastening machines, and leather sewing machines. Holmes wrote the opinion dismissing the complaint, saying, well, these firms don't compete with each other. They make three different things. And he also acknowledged that the merger was an effort at greater efficiency. Well, it turns out even among mergers that are formally classified as horizontal, you get a great deal of product complementarity. For example, the Columbia Steel case was characterized as a horizontal merger between two steel companies, but in fact, one of the parties made heavy steel products, one of the product firms made very light steel products. Here's a little picture that can kind of illustrate this. The two firms consolidated in U.S. Steel. They both made sales by bidding on jobs. Consolidated was the bigger firm. It bid on, it was actually the smaller firm, made more bids, but the individual transactions were much smaller. It made a little bit over 6,000 bids. U.S. Steel made 2,400 bids, but they only bid on the same job 166 times. That is something like 2% of their overall sales. Well, was that merger properly classified as a merger of competitors, or was this really a merger of complementary products in which the post-merger firm was attempting to extend its market range over a wider variety of steel products and also a wider variety of customers? Brown Shoe involved two mergers of firms that produced in two different portions of the shoe market. Brown made higher priced, higher quality shoes. Kenny, the acquired firm, made lower quality shoes. That was true of JetBlue. It was true in the General Dynamics case. And indeed, upon inspection, it's true in most cases. After the Brown Shoe decision, a number of courts condemned mergers of complements, but on the theory that the merger reduced costs or produced a better product. So, for example, Foremost Dairies, which was same year as Brown Shoe, condemned traditional dairy products manufacturer and an ice cream manufacturer. The theory of harm was that the merger enabled the company to deliver dairy products at wholesale from the same truck as ice cream. So it had the advantage it could sell grocery stores a wider variety of products. The Ellis-Chalmers case was a case that condemned a merger of a firm that made steel mills and a firm that made the electrical hookups for those mills. And once again, the theory is that the merger created a competitive advantage because now a single customer could go to the defendant and get a full service, ready to go steel mill complete with its electric hookup, and that gave Ellis-Chalmers a competitive advantage over rivals. The Wilson case did the same thing with sporting equipment and gymnastics equipment. And so, that raises the question, this is guideline 6 of the merger guidelines, that mergers that entrench a dominant position refers heavily to mergers of complements. But the one thing that needs to be sorted out, and that the guidelines do not sort out, is to what extent do these mergers entrench a position simply because they enable the firm to offer a superior product than the two individual firms had been prior to the merger. Very quickly on dominant, I know I'm running out of time here. Dominant platform acquisitions, I think, need a new look. We've had a great deal of hand-wringing because the major platforms, that would be Alphabet, Meta or Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, have acquired a lot of small firms, numbering actually in the hundreds. But if you start looking at them, you see that only a relatively small percentage of them are acquisitions of competitors or firms that really have a realistic chance of becoming competitors. Most of them are mergers of complements, which means that the merger is being used by the dominant firm to acquire some feature or product that it did not have previously. The example I gave here is Alphabet and Vutal, right? Vutal was a tiny firm that invented technology for doing image searches, which has now become a widely accepted portion of search engines. Well, Alphabet, Google, acquired Vutal not in order to eliminate a competitor, that may have been a purpose, but in order to adopt Vutal's technology so that it could add image searching to its search engine product, and I think those things need to be reconsidered because such mergers may actually be beneficial rather than harmful. The last point points out that in some of those cases, maybe many of them, you could get the same result with a non-exclusive license, which would give the acquiring firm the advantage to use the acquired product, but not the ability to exclude others. I'm going to skip over double marginalization. I assume everybody knows what it is, but every time you have a merger of complements, you have to at least consider the possibility that the merger is producing higher output and lower prices by eliminating double marginalization, which might occur when two independent sellers of complements each set their output and price independently without being able to coordinate them. And then finally, then I'll be done, mergers on multi-sided platforms. This is another novelty in the 2023 guidelines. My problem with it is that it's totally focused on harms, but not at all on the benefits. And the benefits largely arise from complementarity, which occurs because when you increase the size of networks, you can increase the range of positive direct and indirect network effects. So for example, I give the example here of a merger of two dating sites where each one has 10,000 members. After the merger, the two networks merge into one. Now they've got 20,000 members, and that makes the post-merger firm more attractive to the extent that if you're on one side of that platform, you have more people on the other side of that platform to treat as a potential dating partner. You could even carry it in more extreme situations like Uber and Lyft, right? Uber and Lyft are the two dominant rideshare apps today. Merger between Uber and Lyft would very likely be challenged. However, the fact is that if Uber and Lyft should merge, you would get more drivers on one side, more riders on the other side. That might make operation of the two apps more attractive. It might reduce wait times and things like that. So in other words, measuring efficiency effects on network mergers is a different thing whose metrics at this point remain largely unexplored, but something we should think about. Okay, I am finished. Thank you very much for putting up with all of that. And I guess at this point, Julian, I just take some questions.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a great presentation, and we're very thankful for your generosity. I invite anyone who has a question to raise their hand, and
Sounds like I convinced everybody, Julian.
Uh,
I think Paulo Bournier has.
Pablo.
Hi, hello, Julian. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I didn't find my raised hand button. Hello, Professor. It's
You know
lovely
what?
to
I
see
always
you.
have that problem too. I never find the button.
Thank you. It's lovely to see you, Professor. Hello
You
to
too.
everyone. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It's always great to hear you, but especially with this very balanced approach. At the same time, I mean, highlighting what's positive about the new U.S. Guideline, but also in a very constructive criticism in some of the aspects. My question is more if you have any reaction concerns most of Latin American competition authorities. One of the things that I held from your presentation was the complexity of the measurements of any merger review, and the new guideline from the US tries to address this, and with some different suggestions. I wouldn't say tools, but some different metrics. But that does not avoid the complexity of that you mentioned several times throughout your presentation. So in the Latin American context, apart a few competition authorities, most of them, and we're talking around 20 to 25 merger control regimes. So we have around 20 competition authorities in the region that has merger control, that apply merger review, with very few limited resources, human resources, for instance. What advice would you give to them? Should they focus on the simple? Should they focus on horizontal mergers? Should they focus on cartel enforcement? Because your presentation, although very interesting, and it really was, for very limited resources, competition authorities, this is something that I can see them struggling with. Would you have any advice to make things more simple?
Yeah, my advice would be first concentrate on horizontal mergers. That is to say, vertical mergers and potential competition mergers, they have been theorists' playgrounds for decades. But the actual payoffs in both areas, I think, have been rather small, particularly in relation to the complexity of the theories. So that would be my one recommendation. Focus on mergers of competitors. Number two, I think you come up with a guideline number. The HHIs are I think, pretty useful. And then you apply that number. But I think you revise the number from time to time, just like we're doing in the US right now, perhaps every 10 years or so. Sorry, excuse me. Just as kind of a reality check, are we doing this? Are we doing this right? But then when you litigate individual cases, you pretty much have to stick to the presumptive numbers. The third one, which does require resources, is you have to try to get market definitions right. Inaccuracies in market definitions are a big problem in horizontal merger analysis because, well, in large part because the process of squaring market shares exaggerates errors. If you've got a firm whose true market share is 20%, but you mistakenly calculate it as 25%, well, that's roughly a 25% error in the calculation of the share. But then when you square those numbers, you get 400 for 20%, and you get 625 for 25%. It results in an exaggeration of more than 50% once you've applied the HHI. So that is one downside of HHIs, is that if you get the market share wrong using the HHI, then your analysis goes from being merely off to being quite a bit off. So, you know, if you're going to spend resources, spend it on the market share. Once you do that, then applying the HHI is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And I would not entertain a lot of debate about firm specific efficiencies or so on. I would not say that's zero, but they would have to be pretty obvious. Uh, and doing them that way, I think, would be relatively simple. I don't think merger analysis ever gets to be super simple, but it would be relatively simple. And then I think the payoff from effective horizontal merger review is it's not as high as going after naked cartels. That's probably the highest payoff area of antitrust enforcement that we have. But it could be fairly significant, and I think it's significantly greater than the payoff of going after unilateral practices by large digital firms where there is so much uncertainty, so much theory pointing in different directions, and frankly, so many difficulties today about measuring market power on two-sided platform markets. So, I mean, those are big, expensive cases to bring. You know, just thinking back to the IBM case, the big disastrous IBM case that the U.S. brought in '69 and then finally dismissed without any legal results in '82. At the time it was dismissed, it was in fact the single most expensive antitrust action ever brought in U.S. antitrust law. And I think, you know, it's too early to say for these big cases against Alphabet and Apple and so on, like we've got right now. But I think they're going to go down that same route. They're going to be incredibly expensive. They're going to involve district courts and appeals and remands, and they're just going to cost a fortune, and perhaps for results that are painfully small. So, you know, I for my money, it would not be a mistake just to leave them alone. And furthermore, if you're a smaller jurisdiction, you can frequently benefit from rules that are being applied in larger jurisdictions because, you know, most of the big platforms comply by revising their products globally rather than individually. That's not always the case, but it is sometimes. So, you know, do a little bit of free riding in that area. But I think you can have a very healthy antitrust enforcement policy that focuses on collusion and horizontal mergers.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
There's one in the chat, Julian.
Pablo.
Hi. But let's. I just saw that there's a question in the chat. By Ricardo Mota. I don't know if Ricardo wants to go first. Yep.
Ricardo.
Yeah, definitely. I wrote in the chat, but I can definitely speak out here. Hi, Professor.
Hello.
You were mentioning about the complementary technologies that all of these companies they develop for helping and for complementing the technology already developed by big techs, for example. And one of the arguments that people usually make is that these complementary technologies they are developing precisely because these companies want to be acquired by the big techs, by the incumbent in the end of the day.
Actually, that's true.
And on the other hand, people argue also that, and you mentioned this point that there are other options. For example, licensing would be a very good option because companies would be compensated by the technology, and still you would have you would have still a different company, which not integrated inside the tech company in the end of the day. My question is about this balance of incentives, because that's fine that we argue that these complementary technologies, that they would not compete with the big techs, but if this kind of mergers start to be blocked in the end of the day, wouldn't these companies try to develop a more challenging technology, or at least they would be incentivized to go further and try to challenge the incumbents in the end of the day, so you would have more competition brought by these complementary technologies, or not? What do you think about this balance of incentives?
Well, okay, you're talking about a short run gain from acquiring a complement and a potential longer run loss to the extent that firm might have developed into a competitor later on down the road. I tend to favor the short run rather than the long run, simply because the longer the run you look at, the more complex it gets, the harder it gets to show causation. And, as a result, I tend to be kind of skeptical of those claims unless there's a path that's pretty clear. If an acquired firm is on the way toward developing a competing technology, then we might want to look at that one a little bit more closely. I strongly favor, and I think this is a completely underutilized tool, I strongly favor the use of non-exclusive licenses where they will work. Now, they may not always work, but if you've got a firm that is building a complement, that offers a complement and might also be investing in resources as a future competitor, excuse me, I think the way to go is to permit the platform to acquire a non-exclusive license that gives the platform everything it needs, right? Non-exclusive license permits it to take full advantage of that acquired firm's intellectual property, but it does not give it the power to prevent that firm from going ahead and developing a competing line of business. So, if that can be made to work, I think that's a preferable alternative.
Okay, thank you.
Pablo?
No, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp, for this, let's say, fantastic presentation. As Paulo just said, is greatly balanced. But I want to hear your opinion, and I know you just mentioned it a couple of times during the presentation, regarding what might be the effect that the guidelines have, that at the end, while trying to prevent anti-competitive mergers, they also may be, with this new set of, let's say, thresholds for Herfindahl-Hirschman index or whatever other indexes that they may use, how do they hit the balance on fostering economic innovation and growth? Do you see that these guidelines may have an impact on the fostering of growth? And I'm saying this because in Latin America we tend to follow what's happening in the US very closely and copy it without giving it the right context. So I just wanted to hear your opinion on what will be the impact that maybe if you have already analyzed it on innovation and fostering economic growth that these guidelines may have.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the enduring, everlasting question in antitrust is how aggressive do you get on competition without harming innovation? I don't want to say too much, but let me say this. The draft guidelines I thought were a disaster. I thought they were anti-innovative. They were way too aggressive. They practically worshipped brown shoe. It was the most backward-looking reactionary document in many ways. And I think a lot of those problems were addressed in the final version of the guidelines. Are there still threats to innovation? Yeah, I think there are some. I mentioned a couple of areas. I think it was wise for the guidelines to take on mergers of complements. I also think it was wise for them to take on network mergers, mergers on two-sided platforms. What I think was not so wise was the very one-sided presentations that saw all of the harms but none of the benefits. They're very unbalanced. And that can have a pretty serious impact on both short-run competition and on innovation. I think I think a part of the problem is that these areas are not as well theorized in the legal literature as they have been. I mean, this is an area that requires a lot of more economic study. We have precious little on mergers of networks yet, but I think the potential for harm to innovation in those areas can be substantial, and that these guidelines do not do an adequate job of addressing that. I'm less concerned about horizontal mergers because I think the standards, it's unlikely that the standards will prohibit the emergence of a highly innovative firm, not where they're set right now. I mean, could it happen? Yeah, but the harms from horizontal mergers are pretty well understood and appreciated. Everybody can see the downsides to horizontal mergers. So I'm not too concerned there. But when we get into these more unusual areas, like mergers of networks, then I think we need to start asking ourselves whether we're doing more harm than good by being overly aggressive with mergers there. That's not a very good answer, I know, but one of the problems is that this is an area there. There's no significant empirical literature of which I'm aware on mergers of networks. We really don't have very much. So if there's any academics in this audience who are advising grad students, IO grad students and so on, I think this is an important area of study. Figure out what mergers of networks are likely to do. And also, the other thing that's understudied is the role of complementary products in merger analysis. Because, when you have a merger of pure complements, you're not increasing concentration at all. What you are doing typically is eliminating a market transaction, right? Prior to that Ellis-Chalmers merger, customer had to go to one firm for a steel mill, and then it had to go to a different firm in order to get the electric installation for it. So now you got one firm that can do both of those things. It's hard to see anything bad coming out of that merger, although the Ellis-Chalmers case ended up condemning it. And that's an area that is somewhat under-theorized in the merger literature. We've dealt a lot with vertical mergers, which are mergers of complements, but we haven't dealt much with product complementarity as such outside of the vertical context, and we certainly don't have a body of work that in any way resembles what we have with respect to horizontal mergers.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Great. Thanks. I don't see any other hand raised. So, Professor Hovenkamp, please, your final remarks, please.
Oh, I've said everything I want to say. I'm very happy. Thank you so much for giving me your time, and I hope it was worthwhile. And I enjoyed it a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. On behalf of everyone, I want to thank you for your generosity on sharing these very thoughtful views. And well, I hope in the future we can get you back at ForoCompetencia. For the rest, I'll see you next month in the next breakfast. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.